Hey everybody, this is Geronimo from Beyond Taboo, AdultBliss's new podcast. Here we are today on our second episode with Simon Mawson, a co-owner of the AdultBliss sex shop on Adelaide, along with his partner Monique. Isn't that right, Simon? How's everything going?
Very good, Geronimo. Thanks for inviting me on.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for volunteering, for always being a big support to Joel to Grow since the beginning. So it's a pleasure for us to have you today. And the first time we actually meet.
Yes, finally. There's been a lot of emails, but we finally get face to face.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So today we'll be talking about masculinity and how sex shops can be a window into today's masculinity. So, the idea behind this episode is for Simon to tell us a little bit about his experience as a sex shop owner. So, maybe before going in depth with the questions, maybe just some quick fire questions just to get to know you better a little bit. So, Simon, are you more of a book or a movie person?
Lately, audiobooks.
Audiobooks, really?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
have you been listening to?
I transitioned to podcasts recently because I'm in a bit of a podcast funk. But just before that, I was listening to a like high fantasy vampire. Yeah.
Really?
It's an Australian author. Can't remember his name. I'm blanking on it, but it's called Kingdom of the Damned. It's really good.
Sounds interesting. I'll
Yeah,
I'll make sure I ask you the details by email later.
absolutely, for sure. Yeah.
Are you more of a phone call or text person?
Definitely a phone call person. I'm on the upper end of the millennial spectrum, so I'm still a phone call person. Yeah.
That's nice. You know, I also am a phone call person, and I'm always very surprised to see people, to hear people, well, mention that calls feel a little bit invasive sometimes.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. I get that. I get that a lot. A lot of people just text me, and I'm like, yeah, I'll give you a call later.
yeah, that's nice. I rather prefer do that. Much more straightforward in a sense. So maybe just to start learning a little bit about your context and personal experience, let's start with our first question. So I was wondering, what inspired you and Monique to open a sex shop? How did that start?
Yeah, so it's a funny story. It's actually a family business.
Oh, really?
My yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So my mum and my stepdad had a couple of shops. They bought into it when I was in my teens, and I started getting involved in sort of helping them out between staff in my early 20s. Now I was a chef by trade, so I've been working in hospitality for a total of about 13 years, and Monique was in insurance retail. So she used to work in retail, and then she transitioned over to insurance. So when my parents were sort of deciding to kind of semi-retire,
Mm.
we sort of ummed and ahed about it. They sold one of the other shops, and we thought, oh, we'll see what they say, and we picked up the last one, and for me it was I really enjoyed my time helping them out in the shop, whether that was customer service or just doing like the admin sort of stuff. I just kind of enjoyed it,
That's
and
nice.
yeah, and Monique had been in the store a couple of times. We were pretty familiar with the space, and we just talked about it, and we're we've always been very sex positive people. It's always been something that we connected over when we met. It was
Well, I was just thinking that it must have been so particular to be raised by parents so open in that sense.
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I didn't get a lot of that from my mum. Being a single mum,
Mm.
she was just doing her best, and it was like it's funny with single parents because sometimes I think you don't quite get to know them when you're younger because they're just in survival mode, right? And I think when my stepdad and my mum met and then eventually bought into Adult Bliss, mum really came into her own and started to sort of like, yeah, she just seemed more authentic at that point, which was really nice. It was good to see her happy,
That's
and
nice.
I think a part of that, I think we sort of bonded over that Adult Bliss thing because it was something that it's weird to say out loud, but it was something we both had a mutual interest in. So when she sort of retired, I thought, what an opportunity to take over the business and see where a younger, more fresher approach could take it. And we immediately sort of transitioned, not really away from retail, but we transitioned to a more educational platform pretty much from day one. And
That was
our ultimate,
that was like the first step you both took uh, whenever you okay.
yeah. So
That's
Monique
interesting.
and I kind of came at it from an educational perspective, and we sort of went, all right, so how can we add some value to the retail experience
Mm.
without being, I guess, without taking advantage of our customers? And we figured the best way to do that was to educate. And sexual education being what it is, I'm not sure what it's like where you're from, but in Australia, it's terrible. So we kind of thought, what an opportunity to sort of like bring that to our community and sort of build a community of sex positive people around the shop. Yeah.
That's interesting. So, well, the next question I had prepared was about the challenges you faced when opening the sex shop. But since you already owned, I mean, your family owned the sex shop, uh, I guess your mother faced some of the most important challenges. But I'm sure you faced some different challenges when you changed the perspective, right? When you and Monique took control and direction of the business. So, what were some of those challenges?
Yes. So entering this industry is a little bit daunting, I think, at any stage of a business's life. I know that when my parents were looking at expanding, they had 3 stores, and all of those stores had been purchased and rebranded, like already running going concerns. We had tried to put a shop in, sort of set one up from ground zero and do that, and that was well, it never happened because the challenge was it was just so difficult. It's hard to get the council on board. It's hard to
Mm,
find a landlord who is okay with it, and it's
mm,
difficult to find neighbours who are going to be amenable to having you in the area because there's such a stigma around
mm,
the type of business that it is. Again, not sure what it's like in other countries, but in Australia and specifically South Australia, adult stores have historically been synonymous with money laundering and organised crime. So
wow.
yeah, so the motorcycle gangs and stuff like that would use them back in the 80s as a money laundering sort of exercise because it was generally a cash-based business. That doesn't exist anymore. 95% of our purchases industry-wide are electronic transactions, as you could probably imagine. So that sort of influence just doesn't exist, but the stigma is still there.
Mm,
So
I can imagine.
yeah, opening a new store is really difficult. Um, as a going concern, um, a couple of issues that you sort of come across from a business perspective. There's also social issues as well, but from a business perspective, that there's still a lot of stigma when it comes to financial services. In fact, there was a massive thing that just happened in the media here in Australia a couple of months ago regarding financial discrimination for sex workers
Oh,
and
really?
sex-based businesses. So it's constitutionally illegal for banks to withdraw their services for those sorts of reasons, for discrimination reasons. It comes under the Anti-Discrimination Act here in Australia, and they've been basically forced to start behaving.
Yeah, well, I can't believe even these days, even banks, when after all, it's all about the money, So
Yeah, exactly.
I'm surprised to see such reluctance,
Yeah, and
even these
and
days.
the thing that blows my mind about it, just to go off on a little tangent, is in marketing for decades, what's the number one thing in marketing? Everyone says sex sells. Sex sells. Like it's been a core concept of selling products for decades,
Mm.
and to the point where we've been taking advantage of the male gaze in order to propagate capitalism. But when it comes to sexual education, that doesn't sell, apparently. So, I mean, we had our FPOS facility removed without warning. So
Mm.
we were like 2 weeks away from taking over. We still hadn't received our FPOS machine, and we rang the bank and we were like, "Hey, where's our FPOS machine? Oh, sorry, your application's been cancelled." Oh, why is that? No reason. They just wouldn't give us one.
Wow.
Yeah, so stuff like that happens. Insurance is a little bit weird, and dealing with when unfortunately you have to deal with the police. Of course, they sometimes don't quite take you as seriously. If there's a theft or something like that, it's kind of funny, and yeah, it's a little bit disheartening. But
To
for the
deal
most
to deal to deal with what you mentioned, the police, you said?
So, for example, if I had a shoplifter, and I
Oh,
wanted to contact the police about it, it's all a little bit. It's a bit of a joke to them, and sometimes they don't take it as seriously as you kind of would imagine they would if it was a jewelry store or something like that.
yeah, it makes sense.
But for the most part, once you sort of get over those hurdles, you can find your community within the industry, and they can really help you. So one thing I notice about this industry is it's pretty cliquey, but there's a lot of people there to support. There's a lot of support. We have a lobbying group here in Australia called Eros,
That's
which
nice.
I think I've mentioned to
Oh,
Paul a
yeah,
couple of times. Yeah,
we've talked about it.
Eros is a lifesaver for us. Without them, we wouldn't be able to trade, I don't think. There are stores in Australia that aren't members. They don't see the value in it, but for us, it's a constant, steady stream of legal advice and a really good. I mean, they always back you up if you're talking to an organization that doesn't want to interact with your business. Eros is always there to sort of help us out with that sort of stuff. They're the reason that we have Afterpay, PayPal, and
Wow.
companies like Stripe, because they lobbied those companies to include our businesses. So yeah, they're an absolute godsend. Yeah.
No, definitely important to have an organization to represent everyone's desires or will and vision around your industry, inside your industry. So yeah, that sounds great.
I mean, that's all like sort of on a professional level. On a social level, I expected to see a little bit more resistance from some people. But for the most part, most of our friends and family and extended family are more curious than anything, if not just outright supportive. When I first started getting into this industry, there was a little bit of like weirdness with some people, like they didn't
Mm.
understand. But I think when we bought the shop, we made our intentions very public. We didn't sort of hide behind what we were doing. We put our face at the forefront of the business, and we made sure that everyone who knew us and everyone who knew the brand knew that we were coming in from this educational point of view. We want to teach people. We want sex positivity. We want, you know, pleasure focused communication.
Mm.
Like these were pillars of what we wanted to achieve, and I think once we sort of started explaining that to people, we're not just, I mean, yeah, we're not just sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for, sleazy, horny, whatever's. We're
Mm.
actually coming from this from a really different space, and I think that helped a lot.
Yeah, it makes sense. Definitely. And Simon, how did that um, goal translated into concrete actions when it was your turn? I mean, you're talking about this whole sex education approach. So let's imagine we are on those days on the shop. How did you first approach those? Well, that mission, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, initially it was difficult because we weren't entirely sure. Um, we weren't entirely sure how to sort of use the business as a platform for that. And eventually, I think the first thing we did within the first couple of months, we launched a blog. It was the most accessible way for us to sort of get information out there. And as you guys know, it's a really great way to promote
Definitely.
products, as well as create some interaction with customers and share knowledge. So the blog was sort of the first thing we started doing. Monique and myself used to write predominantly all of the articles on the blog. We now
It
have a
takes
team.
time.
Oh, it is really time consuming, yeah. Especially when you have an aesthetic that you're trying to achieve.
Mhm.
And for me, I'm pretty dyslexic, so I have a sort of a learning disability when it comes to written text. So writing stuff down has been really difficult for me.
Mm,
But the blogs helped me kind of like flex that muscle and get a little bit more comfortable with
that's great.
with writing, which is great. And yeah, the blog now, I have an editor. Sarah runs it pretty much exclusively for me. Sarah's
Nice.
amazing, and we have 8 authors on the blog now, freelance writers that we contract to write for us, and a lot of them write for other publications as well. And it's generating some pretty awesome content, and it's getting some really good interactions, and I think the next step after launching the blog was, okay, so how do we get our in-store customers reading all of this content? So it's so basic and super simple, but we just started making pamphlets. And someone comes into the store and, for example, buys some Joke to Grow balm. We'll slip a pumping pamphlet into their bag that basically walks them through things to the 3 main things to watch out for when you're using pumps or doing any kind of work with your penis or scrotum, and a link to your website because it's your product and we want people to know where it comes from, but also a link to a blog article or a category of articles on our website. And we've seen that approach is working. It works really
Wow.
well. Yeah. We get obviously we can track when people use our QR codes. We can see how many people scan them, and we can't really see what they do once they get on the website, but we know that people are going, oh, look at this pamphlet. Oh, there's information about the product I just bought. Oh, I should probably know more about this.
Mm,
And that's how you sort of engage with those in-store customers.
mm,
Some of our pamphlets are, they'll say things, stuff like pumps, but cock rings and stuff like
mm.
that. There's some safety concerns. Like, as you well know, there are some ways that, it can. Sorry, I've just got an alarm going off, apparently. There are ways that those sorts of things can go wrong. You can cause damage, and it's important that people
Definitely.
know. Yes, and one of the big ones is anal sex or anal play. So many people have no idea what they're doing when they start anal play, and they think it's just like putting a penis into a vagina. But when you start explaining, well, anuses don't lubricate themselves, and they're not really. You sort of have to learn how to receive something anally. It's not something you can just start off with. You start explaining these things to people, and all of a sudden they realize, oh, it's not something I'm just meant to know about. Sex isn't something that I was born within
Exactly.
eternal knowledge for, right?
Yeah.
There are nuances to it, and there are social constructs that are attached to it, and if I want to be better at sex, or if I want to enjoy sex more, or if I want to master my own pleasure, or improve my sexual literacy, I'm going to actually have to do some research. So once you sort of get people onto that path, they really delve into it. Especially, I find, if they're in a relationship with someone else who's interested, and they can sort of go on that journey together.
Yeah, well, that definitely changed the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I had another question. Um, it's interesting how paper still, the novel paper is still a great way to reach people, right?
Yeah, it blew
So
my mind as well.
it's amazing. In that sense, apart from these pamphlets and this educational approach you started to take, I'm sure there was another portion or part of the whole game changing whenever you took over, that it was also about changing products or changing the variety. So I was wondering if there were any products you were hesitant to include, but you still did because they are like bestsellers, for example.
Yeah.
If there were a couple of situations like that one.
Yeah, so along with the education side of things, we really did want to focus on, it's such a cliche, but we really did want to focus on quality products. And it's really important, I think, for people to realize that there are materials um, that aren't safe to put inside your body. And unfortunately, for a very long time, sex toys were made out of those materials. So, yeah, and there's no regulation. There isn't a country, as far as I'm aware, on the planet that regulates sex
Oh,
toys
really?
in the way, that
Wow.
the FDA, for example, would regulate medications and other medical devices. In Australia, we have the Therapeutics Goods Association, and they regulate therapeutic goods, and medications and pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. But none of them do sex toys. So it's up to us as store owners, or the industry as a whole, to sort of make change when it comes to bad practices of sex toy design. So, for example, a lot of products used to be made from a rubber compound called PVC. Um,
Yeah. I know
Yep.
that.
And if you've ever seen like just really old, realistic looking dildos, sometimes they have a bit of a scent. You can smell a little bit of a chemically scent on them. They're made from PVC. And
Oh.
yeah, it took us less than 12 months to transition away from PVC. So when we first bought the store, we said, all right, all of this stock, we're not ordering it anymore. And we spoke to suppliers and we said, just so you know, from now on, we won't be ordering any products of PVC in that, because it,
Are there still products being
oh,
manufactured with?
absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, not to name any names, but there are some really big companies.
Wow.
There's three big American companies that produce probably 60% of the industry's products, and I would say nowadays less than 20 to 15% of their products are still made with PVC.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, so it's still a big part of the industry, and they'll say things like phthalate free, body safe, blah 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 blah.
And they're not.
They can say whatever they want because no one's regulating them. There's no one holding them to account, and the science around how these products interact with the human body isn't fully fleshed. But what we do know is that PVC is a material that breaks down just naturally. It doesn't stay in, like silicon, for example. Silicon, it's benign. It does what it does, and it doesn't break down. You can apply heat to it. You can cool it down. You can apply friction. You can wet it, and it just stays as is. But with
Wow.
PVC, if you apply a little bit of friction, microscopic parts of it start flaking off. And we know that, well, I mean, these days we call them microplastics, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's a whole other side to that. So so we transitioned to acrylic, ABS plastic, or silicon.
I was just thinking the fact that, well, I'm guessing most of these products were, let's say, insertable products.
Yep.
So, in a sense, we could think or we could view this whole this regulation of materials um, also by, well, a complete lack of defense to women's health in a sense. If you think about it, because, well, I'm guessing, I don't know how we could compare how materials come into play for male products in that sense, but I just thought about that.
Yeah, and it's less of an issue with penis focused products. You know, one of the things that I notice a lot in the industry is there is this sort of, I guess, there is this sort of relationship between um well, I guess it's a discrimination thing, really. Like you've
Yeah,
got on one
definitely.
hand, it's a pleasure product, so you know it doesn't hold the same weight as a health product, for example, which is ridiculous in its own. But then on the other side of that, it's predominantly and historically a women's pleasure product or a vulva owner's pleasure product, which we've already got a marginalized group of people. Not only are they women, but they're promiscuous women at that. So you get this sort of who cares approach to
Mm,
it. And
mm,
almost, yeah, it's almost like it's not even like who cares. It's almost like, well, the more we think about it, the more we want to ban it, you know, or get
mm,
rid of it or hide it. You know, in New
mm,
South Wales, for example, adult stores aren't allowed to be on the ground level. They have to
mm,
be on the second story or in a basement. You can't have an adult store on the ground level. And this is just another way to, you know, put a barrier to pleasure.
wow, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. That's in New South Wales, and I think in that rule also existed in the ACT as well. But for the rest of Australia, we do have some regulations around where adult stores can be. Like you can't put one across the road from a primary school, for example,
Mm.
which is fair enough.
Well,
But
over here, there's no regulation. I mean, there may be a, let's say, tacit rule about it, but you actually get to see sex shops, um, not next to a church, but pretty much, you
yeah,
know.
yep. Yeah. So when we tried to open, as I mentioned earlier, we tried to open up that other location. The council that in that area said that we had to get approval from every business within a 200-meter radius of where we wanted to put the business,
Oh no,
which is in essence
impossible.
illegal. It's actually illegal.
Oh really?
They were yeah. So this comes under the Discrimination Act, Anti-Discrimination Act. Right?
Definitely.
They're not allowed to do stuff like that. But there was a primary school 2 blocks away and a church up the road, and there was a pub next door, and all of them said no. And it's like, well, yeah, it's another barrier to pleasure. It's another barrier to sexual education, and it's another way to sort of marginalized pleasure focused people or sex positive people or promiscuous people, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah,
I
it
had
is
another question,
sure,
Simon.
yeah.
Sorry. Since we are already talking about the products and yeah, maybe the whole purchase experience, I was wondering what has been your overall observation about male customers in your store?
Oh, so there's a few there's a few archetypes, right? Um, but things have changed a lot. So when I first got into the industry, I think 80% of our customers were men who were alone, or shopping alone. Um,
That's interesting.
yeah, yeah, and I think the narrative around adult stores were that if you were a female presenting person, you would send your masculine partner into the store. It wasn't a place for
All
you to
right.
go. And your masculine partner could make decisions about your pleasure for you. I think that was probably
Wow.
some kind of like archaic kind of older sort of mentality, but also that like stores like ours weren't safe. Like that was the assumption. It's not safe to go in
Mm,
there. There's
mm.
organized crime and all that kind of stuff. And the internet wasn't a thing, blah, 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 blah. These days, that has completely changed. I'd say more than 70% of our customers are couples, whether they're same-sex couples or hetero couples. They're coming in together. They're talking about mutual pleasure, which I think is amazing. These days, the kind of men that come into, or masculine people that come into the store are kind of split down the middle, I think. I think some of
Oh,
them are
really?
buying gifts for their partners, and they've got, quote unquote, no idea what they're looking at. They'll come in and they'll just be like, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know what I'm looking at. Can you help me out?" Like that kind of thing. Or they're genuinely invested in their partner's well-being, and that's lovely to see. Or they're coming in for themselves. They're coming in for sexual stamina enhancements. They're coming in for pumps. They're coming in for masturbators and cock rings and well, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I mean, over the last 5 years, we've seen a huge uptick in prostate stimulation in heterosexual men.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's interesting. Well, it's great to hear that. I mean, there's still so much stigma and reluctancy about the topic.
absolutely. But we're seeing a lot of willingness to go down that route these days, from all sorts of people. People often say, one of the most common questions I get when people come in the store, usually from masculine folk, "Oh, what kind of people come in here? What kind of customers do you have?" And my response is always, people just like you. 90% of my customers are people just like you. Like, you're in here for a reason, right? You're not an outlier. And it's something that I try to impart on almost everyone that comes into my shop. I want them to feel like they're not the only one like them who comes in. I want them to feel part of a community and to feel welcomed by the community in a way that makes them feel comfortable being in there. One of people's biggest fears, especially male or masculine people's biggest fears when they come into an adult store, is that they're going to bump into a friend or someone they know or a family member. And my response to that's always, who cares? And I know that's such a privileged thing to say, but they're in
Are
there
we
as well.
talking about young customers or more, let's say,
I would say
well,
young people don't care, really.
okay.
Like, yeah, Gen Z is my favorite generation when it comes to sex positivity. They don't care. They love it. I have young people, 18 and up, coming into the store with their best friends. I have young boys in high school who are over 18 coming in with their male friends and talking about masturbation and talking
Wow.
about pleasure. And that, for me, is the best
Wow.
thing in the world. I love that version of masculinity. For me, that is the goal. Having an open and honest dialogue about pleasure, having an open and honest dialogue about sex and self-exploration, I think is super important for masculinity. And my mates, I'm in my mid-30s, and a lot of my mates are in their mid to upper 30s. And when I try to talk to them about sex, or when you can see they're coming to me to ask me questions because they're unsure, it's such an awkward exchange. And like, I make it, I intentionally make it awkward because I'm just a bit of a pot stirrer, right? But I do that in a way to kind of normalize it. Like, you've probably noticed, I'm very interested in using proper terms for genitals. I'm very interested in using, making sure that folks feel comfortable with their pronouns and their gender expressions around me. So, when my friends come to me about this sort of stuff, I just say the words and I talk about it like an educator, because that's really
It's
important to
great.
me. Yeah, but yeah,
That's fantastic.
older mask folk. We've got a lot of traditional masculine folk that come in, and they're the ones that are a little bit less into talking, and they're generally older millennials and boomers. But for the most part, yeah, I think a lot of men and a lot of cisgendered men and a lot of mask folk are really challenging the idea of masculinity around sex and pleasure lately, and I think it's great. I think it's really good.
That's fantastic, definitely. So you could say the main concern is probably the fear of stumbling upon someone that you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And my general reply to that is just like, they're in here as well. You're both in here. Like, you've both got this thing in common. It's not that you've both got this dirty little secret or this thing that you're trying to keep quiet. You've both got something in common, and that's that you're sex positive, you're pleasure focused, right? And these are good things. These are good things. These are non-repressive, positive things, and they're good for your mental health. So it's great that you find people in your family or people in your friend circle that have that in common with you, I think.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, whenever I was thinking about these episode questions, I imagined, um, well, more concerns actually. I wasn't expecting at all the fear of stumbling upon someone you know. I was expecting more like, I don't know, well, how, let's say, using an X product would, in a
Mm.
way, affect your sexual orientation in a sense.
Yeah, yeah. There is a bit of that. I think a little of probably about 4 or 5 years ago, the notion or the concept of pegging came into the zeitgeist. Yeah, yeah. So for folks who don't know, pegging is where generally a vulva owner would wear a harness with a dildo, and they would use that dildo to penetrate a masculine person anally. That's like
Hmm.
the general archetype. But these days, when we talk about pegging, it's using a dildo on someone else anally, regardless of gender or gender roles. And that pegging became really popular.
Well, I have
Like
a
crazy
question
popular.
about that.
Yeah,
I have
sure.
a about pegging. What do you think is the explanation for the emergency of a term when we already had a term for that?
Interesting. So I that's a very interesting question. I think the biggest divide between anal sex and pegging is it's I think initially it was a gender thing. I think initially it was a role reversal thing, right? It was a masculine submissive action. And I think to sort of like lean on what you mentioned earlier about people being concerned about those sorts of acts and how that affects their masculinity, I think that was the kink. Initially, that was the fetish. That was the kink. That role reversal was taboo, and it was,
That's very interesting.
secretive, right? And for I think for vulva owners or femme presenting people, it was an opportunity for them to be dominant, And I think for couples that got into it um, with that sort of way of looking at it, I think that was just a really fun and exciting approach for them to sort of explore this gender reversal, this role reversal thing. So I think that's why we have a separate word for it.
Mm.
And I think the reason that it got popular if I'm being honest, I think it was TikTok. I think it was women and
That's unexpected.
them presenting people on TikTok talking about pegging their partners in a joking kind of like, you know, feminist movement kind of way, right? It was this sort of feminist movement zeitgeist thing that was happening. And a lot of women started bringing it up with their partners and realizing that their partners were kind of into it. I mean, before that, there was all these jokes about, or jokes or comments or situations where people were talking about the finger in the butt during oral sex, right?
Mm,
I think that
yeah.
was kind of the floodgates opened at
Spark.
that point. Yeah, exactly. That was the spark that lit the fire that was what has now turned into a very large part of my industry, prostate stimulators, and a huge cohort of research around prostate stimulation and health benefits for prostate
Wow.
stimulation. Yeah, I mean, when we have folks that have had prostate cancer, if they've had chemotherapy or partial surgery removal, prostate stimulation is the first thing that we'll recommend in order to
Wow.
help with erectile bounce back.
I
It's
didn't know that.
so powerful.
Wow.
It's a really, really, really good thing to do. And there is some research, and it's very new research, and there's not a lot of information about it, but there is some research to suggest that regular prostate stimulation can actually either postpone or reduce your chances of getting prostate cancer in the first place.
Wow.
Yeah, which you know, folks with prostate cancer it's getting a bit worse. Like, it's a problem. It's happening a lot more these days. So anything that we can do to combat that and have a really good time doing it is
Yeah, I was just
is
about to comment
worthwhile,
on that,
right?
you know.
Yeah. So yeah,
It's
that's
not about homework, definitely.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, I often say this to folks about penis pumps. You know, I talk about pumping, not so much from an enlarging point of view, although that is an excellent benefit, but from an erection strength and erection health point of view. I say to my clients all the time, especially younger clients in their late 20s, early 30s, start pumping now. Do it regularly. Do it 3 times a week. Do it as much as you can now, and get into a regular routine so that when you're in your 50s, 60s, and 70s, you've got strong erections, you've got,
Mm.
you know, you've practiced, you've got climax control. Like, pumping has all of these things. But unfortunately, pumping's kind of boring, right? Like, you can have a bit of fun with it, but it's not about climax. It's not about pleasure. It's, you know, it's almost like going to the gym. It's a workout in a way.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think most guys are most of the mask folk that I see are getting into it. We're seeing a big shift. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Definitely, the future holds good hope. So great to see these changes. Well, in that sense, would you say there are also some other um, trends that are rising within male customers? Stuff you get to hear whenever you get visitors at the sex shop. Maybe any trends you can recognize and share with us.
Yeah. So the pegging thing has been massive. Like, it's probably been one of the biggest movements in male sexual pleasure in my time in the industry. I think the other thing that I'm noticing, if we're being a little bit more meta, is the way that mask folk shop, I think, has changed. I think initially, or originally, back in the early days, and I think I caught the tail end of this a little bit when I first got into the industry. The predominant reason for a masculine person to come into the store was for pornography, or to buy their partner a toy to, quote unquote, shut them up. Right? Like, this was
Wow.
sort of, yeah, and this is kind of the terms that we would hear. You know, it was like, oh, I got to get her something, to make her happy, or whatever, or they're buying pornography, and
That's strange.
yeah,
I'm
yeah, it's
I
super strange. Yeah,
I didn't expect that at all.
no, so I don't know what I don't know what it's like in other countries, but in Australia, masculinity's got a we've got a bad rap. Traditional masculinity's got a pretty bad rap, and I think we had a real struggle in our sort of microclimate getting cisgendered men to accept sex toys. Full stop.
Okay. Now I get where it comes. Okay.
So vibrators were seen as a threat to my masculinity. They're a threat
Exactly.
to my ability to
I'm
perform.
not enough and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And our narrative, our industry narrative, our community narrative around that for the past decade has been sex toys are your friend. If you can use them to help make your partner happy, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you want your partner to be happy? And that was that's kind of the rhetoric that we've been spewing for decades now, and that's finally catching on. And I think again, this has I'm not a big fan of social media, but social media has absolutely helped with this. It's given women's pleasure a voice, and it's allowed them to create communities around this. I mean, you jump on. I'm not a big fan about talking about brands, but you jump on any Womanizer, WeVibe, Lilo, any of their Instagram pages, and the comment sections are just filled with pleasure-focused, sexually positive women that are just loving owning vibrators. And I think men see that. I think cisgendered men and mask folks see that. And there's one cohort that's intimidated by it, and they have a visceral reaction to women being able to pleasure themselves, right? And you see this in politics all the time when you get a politician that will, what was that guy's name in America who made a comment about that WAP video clip? Oh, I don't know, my wife doesn't get wet in bed or something. They have like this visceral reaction to it. Or they have a little bit of self-reflection and they go, oh, okay, maybe I should, instead of roses or a box of chocolates, maybe I should buy my partner a vibrator, And I think that's changed the dialogue a lot.
Yeah, I think it now it definitely makes sense to me. Yeah.
And so to answer your question, sorry for the tangent, to answer your question more concretely,
No, not at all.
I think one of the biggest changes that we're seeing is that mentality of I'm here to, for her to do her thing, or for me to buying couples toys, buying app compatible products that we can use together, buying masturbators, buying strokers, getting my partner a vibrating cock ring that I can wear that will stimulate them while we're having sex.
Well, definitely
I think
the whole pleasure giving thing has drifted into a shared thing rather than something you use to nurture your, let's say, well, maybe power in a sense.
Yeah.
So, to picture sex toys more like allies rather than your competition.
Absolutely, and I think porn. You gotta be really careful when you talk about porn, because there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. So I'll preference this by saying I consider porn a tool to be used for desire, right? It's like you wouldn't watch a Marvel movie and think that was reality. So you shouldn't watch porn and think that that's reality. Porn is performative, and it's not a how-to guide, right? But the one thing porn has done is it has brought sex toys into couples pleasure. There's a couple of male porn stars that you will almost always see with a vibrating wand or some kind of sex toy. And I think they're mainstream porn stars doing this. They're using wands on their partners. They're focused on female pleasure. They're focused on getting their partners across the board.
Do you mind? Do you recall some of them?
Um, I know that there's a guy named Small Hands. That's his porn name, Small Hands.
Interesting name.
Yeah, it is an interesting name. He's been around for a while. I'd say he's probably in his late 30s now. He's covered in tattoos, and you see him with a Hitachi wand quite often. Um, I can't remember the other guy's name, but he's got a channel. He's got OnlyFans and stuff like that, and he's got a channel where he meets women and has sex with them. But his whole brand is about intense female orgasms,
Wow.
and and I I wonder how performative it is, but it's performance. Like I said earlier, it's performance, and he's using really intense sex toys. He's asking his partners, what kind of stimulation do you like? Are you likely to have an orgasm from anal penetration, or are you likely to have an orgasm from clitoral stimulation only? Are you going to come during penetration? He'll ask them questions like that, and he'll use their answers to make sure that they reach climax. Which
So that communication part, is it something that goes along or through the video, or like
I
an
imagine that, yeah,
interview introduction, let's
it's
say?
it sort of starts at the beginning, and I think this is a really good example of how we should communicate about sex in general, right? Like whether it's with a partner that you've been with for years, or whether it's a new sexual partner. I was just listening to a podcast recently, this is a South Australian based podcast, and they were talking about how sexy it is when their hookup. You know what? You like some dating apps are just for hooking up, right? They're just for sex. How they talk about their partners, their prospective partners, ask them what they like in bed, and they have this whole foreplay thing around consent, this sexy sort of intro before they've even met. And it's like turning consent into this really sexy, pleasure focused foreplay, sort of activity. And seeing that in porn is like mind blowing, right? Like seeing that actually play out on screen is incredible. And I think the first time, well, for me and for some of my clients, especially, the first time that you have sex after having a really in-depth conversation about mutual pleasure and about partnered pleasure is just a game-changing event, right? It completely flips the script. And I think for
Sure.
men, mask folk, having conversations like that aren't in our rule book. We're not given the
No, definitely.
tools.
Yeah.
Traditionally, we're not given the tools to have those kind of vulnerable conversations.
Mm.
But personally, I don't know about you, but personally, I think one of the most, masculine thing you can do is make your partner feel pleasure. Like that's like, for me, getting vulnerable and being able to make my partner happy is kind of what I hinge my masculinity on sexually. So I think that's really important. And I think seeing it, using toys, allowing your partner to peg you, like whatever it is, whatever gets them there. Yeah, it's really
It's fun
important.
to explore, definitely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that approach, not a lot of people are putting words to it, but as a community thing, I think it's happening. I think
Yeah.
we're getting there slowly, especially
No,
with this
you're
young
right.
generation. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's definitely changing. For example, I was thinking while you were sharing how things are there in Australia and over here. For example, when it comes to just just a detail to add to the whole reflection. But for example, in countries like Argentina, well, masturbators, for example, are quite expensive. You don't get that huge variety you get to see probably in Australia or in the United States. There
So
are a couple of
you folks have a pretty isolated economy, is that right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
the whole importation side of things. It's quite complex and delicate here. Um, we would need another podcast to talk about it, you know?
Literally just listening to a podcast about your economy like a week ago, and that just when we had that conversation about the microphone last week, I was like, oh yeah, wow, Argentina, yeah,
Well, it's an interesting
very
example.
interesting, yeah.
But yeah, for example, over here, it's not so common for men to use masturbators in their own pleasure time, in their solo time. You get to see maybe more often those Tenga X.
Yeah, yep.
We have those, but definitely you don't get to see those high tech masturbators with the suction base, you know, and
Yeah, yeah.
but
Flashlights, you got flashlights.
there are a couple. Yes, there are a
Yeah.
couple. But yeah, but people tend to be more old school in that sense.
Yeah. And I imagine that comes with, see, I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, right? So something that happened in the last decade was the brand Fleshlight
Uh,
they lost their patent on their product. It ran out. And up until that point, you couldn't really make masturbators without infringing on the Fleshlight patent.
I didn't know that. That's very
Yeah,
interesting.
I don't know a lot about it, but this is the general dot points of it. So when the patent ran out, and I think that was back in like 2019, it was not long ago. We're talking 5 years, right? We had fleshlights, we had a couple of suction devices with like silicon interiors, and you had pumps with sleeves, like auto pumps. You could press a button and it would suck, and there was a sleeve that you could put inside it. There wasn't much else out there.
Hmm.
There was a couple of Chinese companies that were doing some interesting things, but the quality wasn't, you know.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, this patent runs out, and it was like for us, we couldn't react quick enough.
Wow.
It looked like a lot of manufacturers kind of had their finger on the button, waiting, like on the day. Boom, let's manufacture these. Let's get them out there. And all of a sudden, the industry was just full of masturbators. Like they were just coming out of the woodworks left, right, and center. And now I struggle to pick a brand when I'm stocking the store because there's just so many options on the market. And
You know, it would be great to have you maybe some other time to talk about masturbators because I feel there's so much to talk about them.
I
I
would
mean,
love to do that. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, you get to see all those automatic masturbators with voice. You know those.
Yeah. We've got AI. We've got a product called the AutoBlow AI, which is a
Wow.
web interface, artificial
What?
intelligence that learns what gets you off, and
Nah.
you can dude, seriously, and you can
Wow.
it can actually edge you. Like it knows how to edge you. Like it
No
learns
way.
how. Yeah, it's so cool. It's big. Like it's kind of bulky, right? But it's got
You,
this.
you kind of hag it, you know.
Yeah, almost. You've got this thing on your lap almost. But it plugs into the wall, and it looks sophisticated. It doesn't look clunky. And yeah, it's a miraculous device. It's really cool. Love Ends is a big brand for interconnectivity, and they have masturbators.
What was the name again?
Love Ends, so it's LOVEENSE. They have products that connect to each other. So they've got a vibrator that has sensors inside of it, and it knows how deep, for example, it is inside of a vagina. And it'll connect through an app to a stroking masturbator that will mimic those actions. So you
Oh
can
wow.
have virtual sex and feel what your partner's feeling.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, big tangent, huge tangent. But if you want to get me on to talk about mask or penis focused sex toys, I'd love to jump on and do that.
I'd love to. Let's arrange that soon. You know, this whole topic brings us to our last question, which is just about this. So I was wondering if you could briefly tell us what do you think the future holds for this industry? And I'm just mentioning this right now because, well, personally, I feel the whole virtual reality thing is slowly entering the picture, but I'm a complete ignorant when it comes to this new dimension that is surging. So don't feel like conditioned to go through that angle. But
Yeah, no, sure.
what do you think is the future?
So as much as there's pros and some cons here. There's some pros and some cons here. So
Yeah.
hardware technology, I think is
Like
coming a
everything.
long way. And I think we're seeing some really great strides in technology and software used for sex toys specifically. I'm seeing a lot of great Bluetooth interactivity, app controlled, that kind of stuff, right? And I think for mask folk specifically, I think it's all very new, right?
Uh-huh.
And there's so much more to explore. But I think we're seeing some great strides in that sort of space. And I think given the current climate around artificial intelligence,
Mm.
I think that's sort of the next leap forward.
Mm.
And I'm not sure how I feel about that. Um, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I've heard people having conversations, very sexually geared conversations with AIs, specifically chat GPTs, verbal models.
Wow.
And I'm nervous about how AI uses the information that it gathers to create a narrative that would please some
Mm.
people. And I think that could be really dangerous I think that could be really dangerous for the equality movement. I think that can be really dangerous for a community or an industry that's really focused on mutual pleasure.
Mm.
Because once you take the human element away from mutual pleasure, you've got one-sided pleasure. And we're back to where we were in the 80s and the 60s, where men were, pardon the term, but I heard this term recently, and it really made me realize how women see this. But an era where women's pleasure wasn't at the forefront of focus was a
Mm.
time where men, quote unquote, just masturbated into women, right?
Mm.
So it was all about their own pleasure. And I think AI there's a danger with AI pleasure technology that can bring us back to a place where that's an ongoing reality.
Well, it makes sense. My main concern, and I guess it's also something that we can't control much either. But for example, I feel like this this latest time, and it's not like it's mainly a bad thing, but masturbation is starting to feel like the only safe place for lots of men.
Yeah, that's I think there's a little bit, like, I think pleasure can be weaponized on a social level as well. And I think there's a little bit of that going on.
Mm.
I like to look at and I like to promote masturbation as a self-reflection, a time for self-reflection. It's obviously it's great for pleasure, but I think it's important to self-reflect on your role in mutual pleasure while practicing, for all intents and purposes. I think
Mm.
when I was younger, and I think a lot of boys would probably feel the same way. When I was younger, masturbation was always something that you would do alone in secret, and it was for you, right? It was 100% for you. And I think that's good. I think that's great. I think guys having that, or penis owners having that, is a really good thing. But at the same time, if you can share it with someone else, or if you can do it in a way that allows you to bring other people into that experience, I think it's really special. I think it was really powerful.
Mm.
And this is a concept that I didn't click with until I tried mutual masturbation for the first time, like actually masturbating with my partner. And I think realizing that, like, it's sort of like, what is it? It's kind of like the off season. You're practicing for the real thing, right? It's kind of like, if you look at it from that perspective, and you use it as a tool to increase your ability to provide pleasure and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. Self-reflection is important, and I think it being a safe space is. I get what you're saying there. I do get what you're saying there, but I worry sometimes. I worry sometimes around that kind of incel sort of approach to masturbation, where it's like, this thing where I'm not good enough for anyone else, and this is all I've got. I worry about that,
Mm.
because that leads to a not so great place. Yeah, I think, and it also builds on the stigma of masturbation being something that
Mm.
needs to be done in solitude, and I think that's not necessarily the case. But yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe I was picturing a scenario where um, maybe the habits, the masturbative habits, mix or combinates with the interfaces or the way we consume porn, and how these new technologies will enter the picture. And
No, exactly.
I mean, I would tend to think that the the main offer isn't does not pushes as much as we would like reflection into masturbation. Uh, so what I fear, in a sense, is that, well, maybe people will wish or desire more their solo time rather than sharing the pleasure with somebody,
And
and
when
and
you've got, sorry, go on.
no,
When you've
no.
got
Go ahead.
an AI or a chatbot, a verbal chatbot, or even a text-based chatbot whose sole purpose is to provide you with pleasure, it kind of creates this narrative around, well, that's what the other person is, right? They're there for me. And instead of this mutual thing, right? And
Mm.
that's one of the conversations we have about porn all the time, is that it messes with your neural pathways, and it creates a really one-sided
Yeah, definitely.
approach to masturbation, and blah 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 blah. And that's all very true. That is all very, very, very true. But I think porn has its positives as well, and that's a whole other podcast. But the thing that I have with AI is it's just so believably real. Like,
Mm.
sometimes you're sitting there and you're listening to it talk, and you think to yourself, like, you could almost imagine it being an actual person, right?
Mm.
And that person, you can ask them to be whatever you want them to be. And I think that creates a dangerous narrative around a mutual
Exactly.
pleasure. Yeah, yeah, and yeah.
Ethics will be a huge thing, a huge problem, probably in the next couple of years.
Yeah, my main goal is to sort of hope that we don't go down that route. That's a wish for me. I think AI could be fun. I think AI could definitely be fun. I think
Yeah.
AI could be an interesting way of exploring fantasies and that sort of stuff. I've already heard of people using it as a testing ground for threesomes, right? So partners will employ an AI chatbot, an audio AI chatbot, to have like a sexually charged conversation with, to
Oh,
find
wow.
out how they feel about a
Oh,
third
really?
person being in the room with them.
Wow.
Which
That's
I think
unbelievable.
that it's such a great way. It's such a great way to use a tool like that. And yeah, people are using them as like phone sex workers and stuff like that as well. And there's a lot of that going on. But yeah, it's AI is definitely going to be the next leap for this
Hmm.
industry, and it's either going to be a good thing or a really bad thing.
I guess we'll find out soon.
Yeah, I think
I
the
guess.
whole world is waiting to see what AI is
Yeah.
going to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. what in which movie the whole thing turns into, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess it will have a little bit of both sides.
Yes. As with new technologies, there's always pros and cons. So,
Definitely.
and I think, yeah, there's a lot of doomsdayers out there, but I think it's going to be okay. I think we'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, I share that perspective too. I definitely think the future is down that road. So, Simon, it was very interesting to share this conversation to you with you. I mean, we have talked about so many topics, and there were lots of facts I never heard of. So it was so valuable to have you here today and bring your experience. So I appreciate that.
No, thank you so much for having me. When I saw that you folks were doing a podcast, I thought, oh, what an amazing opportunity for me, and I couldn't wait to get involved. And I'm absolutely more than happy to come back. So
I love that. I love that. This was your first time, right? Or
I've done a couple of podcasts before.
oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So in my sort of spare time outside of the shop, I do a little bit of professional development with folks. So I've done some talks with sexologists and people working in the sexual health
That's
industry.
nice.
Yeah, I predominantly speak to people who are in rehabilitation, and I tend to attract a lot of people in the disability sector
Mm,
who are looking for pathways to pleasure that would help people with specific disabilities.
that's right.
So I tend to find myself doing Zoom call workshops like this occasionally. It's something I want to do more of because I love doing it. But yeah, and I have done I have done recently another podcast, and I'm about to do another one soon, and I'm very excited because people
Wow.
finally. Yeah, I love talking about what I do. If you couldn't tell, I can go on a tangent really easily. But yeah, so no, it's this is my first time talking to a masculine specific audience, and it's part of the reason that I was really excited because I think I have a unique perspective on masculinity that I've been sort of cultivating over the last decade or so, and where I'm at in my masculinity, my masculine journey, I've let go of so much societal pressure.
Mm.
I hesitate to use the word toxic masculinity because I know it's like it's a button, and I don't really know how I feel about that whole thing. But I have let go of a lot of like traditional masculine tropes, and I think that I hope that I've had an interesting perspective for your viewers. So
It definitely was. It definitely was. And
excellent.
I'm sure our listeners will be very interested. And people, just for you to know, if you want to reach out to Simon, and maybe if you have any questions or concerns, or if you need any guidance when it comes to whether it's sexual experiences or sex toys, well, Simon is the guy. Well, you just heard how experienced he's on the field, so he will be more than capable of guiding you. And so, if you want to have a chat with Simon, you can find the links, the pertinent links on this episode's description, whether if that's on the contact section from the AdultBliss website or their socials. I'm sure Simon will be more than happy to help you guys.
Absolutely, always happy to field questions for sure.
Simon, it was a pleasure. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much, Geronimo. Absolute pleasure.